Hi, so today I am talking about tariffs and how they can impact or may impact people in the UK or those going back to the UK. Obviously, Trump has brought in a lot of tariffs recently, and today I want to try and sort of demystify what that means for the UK. So first and foremost, what is a tariff? It's not necessarily that easy to understand or something everyone knows about. So a tariff is essentially a tax charge that a country applies to imports. So let's take the US situation. What would happen is you would have someone in the US, maybe a supplier that sells locally, who needs to buy products, and they buy those products from China. When they bring those products into China, if they were previously paying $100 per product, they would now have to pay $110 per product because of the 10% tariff. Now that extra 10 goes to the US government. So in terms of China, they're still getting what they were getting previously. Nothing changes for them. The only thing is that the people importing those goods are now having to pay 10% more than they would otherwise. So it makes sense for them to import from another country or produce locally in the US, and they have no import charges. So when it comes to tariffs, the purpose of them is to help a certain country build its GDP, build what it produces and what it retains. Another use for tariffs is also sanctions. So if a group of countries don't want people to trade with another country, they want to hurt them politically or financially, maybe they put sanctions and tariffs on trade with that country. But in this case, it's all about what we call trade deficits. So the US has trade deficits with other countries, meaning that they import more than they export to them. And just to try and explain that, let's say in the case of, say, China and the US, let's say the US imports $150,000 worth of goods from China and they export $50,000 worth of goods. That means the net difference is $100,000. So they're paying $100,000 more to China than China are paying them, which means that the GDP, what that country produces and the cash that that country generates, is more in China than it is in the US. Now, if the US can get those people ordering from China to order from the US, that money stays in the US and that GDP growth occurs in the US. So it would be good for the government's fiscal policy to apply these tariffs internally, potentially. I will come on to why this may be short-sighted after, but that's the main crux of the matter. Now, when it comes to trade deficits, the top 5 countries or regions or blocks that have trade deficit, or that the US has a trade deficit with, number 1 is China, number 2 is actually the EU, the European Union, number 3 is Mexico, 4 is Venezuela, and 5 is Canada. Now, it's been well publicized that there are tariffs now on China, Mexico, and Canada. I am waiting to see exactly what the implications for the EU will be, but for once, Brexit may not be a bad thing, as the UK is no longer part of the EU. Any tariffs which apply to the EU won't apply to the UK. So potentially Brexit is a good thing, but again, that may be just due to this short-sightedness, and we will cover that a little bit more later down the line. When it comes to the UK itself, i.e. the UK's trade with the US, they're the other way around. The US and the UK, as far as the US is concerned, they have a trade surplus, meaning that they actually export more goods and services to the UK than they import. So for them, it would be the opposite scenario, and it just wouldn't make sense to apply a tariff because they would effectively be shooting themselves in the foot by potentially losing some of the trade that they have with the UK. It's quite strange when you look at the figures produced by the US. They say there is a trade surplus with the UK, and when you look at the figures produced by the UK, they say they've got a trade surplus with the US. It's very close either way, and it's unlikely, in my view, that there would be tariffs placed on the UK by the US. So Brexit has helped there. The next thing that is worth considering is a lot of other countries in and around the UK have already placed tariffs on China for things like electric vehicles. The UK hasn't done so yet, and not to the extent of other countries at the very least. So if they did need to get into a bit of a trade war or a negotiation with the US, they always have the card that they can apply tariffs to China as well to sort of help them. So it's another thing or another reason why I find it very unlikely that the UK would come off bad from any sort of trade agreements with the US in the short term. But bearing all this in mind, and how I've expressed that as far as the US is concerned, applying tariffs is good for their economy, you would then ask the question, well, why don't all countries just apply tariffs? The main reason being, well, if all countries applied tariffs, there would be no trade. But there are other points behind it as well. It's quite short-sighted to assume that it's a good thing. Yes, it probably increases GDP and cash retention in the short term, but there are three big areas to consider in my view when we look at this. And just to caveat this, trade, tariffs, and international trade, this is a big topic. It's very complex, and typically it's something more that an economist would cover and knows a lot more about. I am not an economist, full disclosure. I am a chartered accountant and someone that specializes in financial services. I am not an economist. So if you don't agree with my opinions or views on this, I would be keen to hear your opinions in the comment section below. But there is a close link, and I will do my best to give you my thoughts on the situation. So coming back to my reasons why tariffs are short-sighted. Number one is specialization. So each country tends to specialize in certain things. For instance, if you take the certain Asian countries, they tend to be more dexterous than a lot of other countries. So doing small tasks which involve being very meticulous may be more suited to them. Or if you take, say, the German market, they have a reputation for extremely good quality car making. If you look at climates, you'll have certain countries which are better for growing things like oranges. A real life example of that, which you may or may not have seen in the news, is the situation with avocados and Mexico. So I think Mexico produce 90% of the avocados that go to the US. And given that the Super Bowl is about to come up, there will be a need for a lot of those nachos and dip. So it's something that's been spoken about a lot recently. On the other side of specialization, there is also this idea that focusing on something solely allows you to do it better and more efficiently. And to give you an example of that, let's take two people and you say to someone, okay, I want you to say the alphabet, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and so on, as fast as you can until you get to Z. And let's say they can do it in 10 seconds. If you then take someone else and say, I want you to count to 26 as fast as you can, and they do that in 10 seconds. If you then say to them, I want you to say A, 1, B, 2, C, 3, and do both, but merging them both together, it becomes very difficult because you have to think about it a little bit. So the combined 20 seconds doing them individually probably turns into 30 seconds when you do it that way. And this is a prime example of what specialization is. So if we have it whereby one country specializes in a certain thing and exports it elsewhere, the likelihood is that they will do it better, you'll get a better quality, and they'll do it more efficiently, so the costs are going to be lower. The second thing is economies of scale. So when you do something on a larger scale, typically your fixed costs involved can be spread out across a much higher volume. So when you look at the cost per piece or cost per service offering, it tends to be lower. However, economies of scale are limited to your client or customer base. There's no point having economies of scale by producing 2 million items if you only have customers that are going to buy 1 million, because 1 million would perish or be no good, and that would then hit your bottom line and cost would have to increase if anything. If you have economies of scale and you have a certain country that doesn't just export or doesn't just sell to their own country, they export internationally, it means their customer base is much higher and they can afford to have those higher economies of scale and again sell at a lower price, and the consumer ultimately gets a better service at a cheaper price. And that boils down to my third point, cost and the amount that the consumer pays. There's been a lot of evidence that when there are tariffs, typically it ends up being passed down to the consumer ultimately, especially if the goods that are being purchased or the services that are being purchased are certain luxurious services which people don't mind paying a little bit more for. So ultimately that cost is going to pass down to the consumer. So people in the UK, you're probably thinking, well, it's okay because Daniel said that from a UK perspective, there won't be any tariffs. That's the case, but what we have to look at, or what we have to think about in this situation, is the world trade dynamic. The world trade dynamic is a convoluted, intricate web of transactions, and each transaction has a different cause and effect. So let's say, for instance, the UK imported goods and they become more expensive because those goods which they've imported were from China. Now, China may have had tariffs applied to them, and suddenly their costs have increased as well. So they've had to pass that increased cost onto the UK. So now the UK are having to pay more for their goods from China, even though there's no change in their trade agreements. Now, the UK may feel a bit aggrieved about that and decide that they're going to place tariffs on China so that they can keep things more efficient. China are going to be upset about the tariffs being placed on them. And then you have this spiraling cycle of negativity with each country trying to get back at the other one for placing a tariff on them. Ultimately, it leads to this tit for tat situation where the most powerful countries typically tend to be the ones that come out on top, and the poorest, smallest and weakest countries tend to be the ones that bear the brunt of it and get the raw deal, so to speak. So with this in mind, now you can see why, when I mentioned before the UK not being part of the EU is a good thing, when you focus on the fact that when everything comes out in the wash, typically the more power and the bigger that you are, the better sort of deals you tend to get. Being part of the EU may ultimately be a better thing when it comes to trade. So it's a very, very complex situation. There are many other things to consider when it comes to tariffs. Two of the big things which I haven't touched on are currency exchange rates and how it causes those to change, and bond and gilt rates and how they change because of it. It's far too complex and too much to get into in this video, but I hope that has given you an idea of what may happen in the UK. My view is that in the short term, the UK will be absolutely fine, but if this carries on, potentially in the long term, the UK may feel some of the pain and higher expenses on consumer goods may occur. Hope you've enjoyed the video. If so, please do like and subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.